Hello, everybody. Just another quick lecture on Indigenous ways of knowing. So, I just wanted to do this lecture just to make sure that students are sort of on the same page with how Indigenous ways of knowing are different than possibly Western ways of knowing, and how Western ways of knowing are sort of centered as sort of like the canon, the real way of knowing rather than sort of um, accepting that there's multiple different ways of people knowing things, um, and um, that they're all valid, the different ways of knowing. So I'm going to talk about particularly Indigenous ways of knowing. So I'm going to share my screen again. Yep. Da, 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 da. So this is about Indigenous ways of knowing, um, and just um, recall from one of my previous lectures that there is no one way of knowing in Indigenous thought. Indigenous ways of knowing are different depending on nation, area that they live. Different tribes or nations will have different ways of knowing than others. So that's harkening back to like the notion of pan-indigenous, which is sort of like lumping all indigenous nations together and saying that they're all the same. So we're not trying to do that. So first of all, I want to talk about a few different fancy words that you might hear in um, English literature in particular, because we like these words for some reason. So the first one is epistemology. So epistemology is the study of how we know things. It's concerned with the ways we gather knowledge and what frameworks are in place for how we think. So, what frameworks can you think of that work in the Western world? And how are Indigenous ways of knowing different? So, if you think about what types of frameworks are at play in Western thinking, one of the most obvious ones is religion. Um, when you think of Christianity, um, that really informs the ways that Western people think and act, and how they gather knowledge. So that's one way of thinking of different frameworks for um, how we know things. So that's one thing. Another thing is that sort of British colonialism and other types of colonialism, such as just in general European colonialism, um, happened in sort of like the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and how these sort of ways of knowing were impacted by colonialism. So that's one other way you could think of it. Um, so, how are Indigenous ways of knowing different? So, if you think of different ways of knowing and thinking back to storytelling, you can think of different values that Indigenous people have from Western ways of knowing, different beliefs, different spirituality or religion. Just think of the creation story of Genesis versus the story of Sky Woman, that we went over. Um, those are different ways of knowing and learning. So that's one word that you should probably remember or try to remember, because it will be important later. Next is pedagogy. Pedagogy is the study of how we learn and teach information. So when you're thinking about how you learn and how the university teaches, how do we teach at the university usually? And then you want to question that and say, is it effective all of the time? And then think of how do indigenous nations teach and how is it different from Western pedagogy? So, um, one way that we teach at the university is like this: we lecture at people. We just like sort of talk at people, and they're supposed to listen. So, this way of learning or teaching may not be as effective, especially if there are students who are um, used to learning by doing or learning by listening or learning by seeing. Those are all different ways of learning. Um, and some of them aren't as um, the ways that the university teaches doesn't teach towards those people necessarily. If you think about indigenous nations and how um, indigenous people teach, um, some of it is different. For example, storytelling, again, is a different way of teaching. Teaching values and beliefs and culture is passed down through an oral tradition in some communities. And it's a bit different from Western pedagogy in that a lot of First Nations people teach not only like sort of how to do things by doing them, like actually doing them. For example, how to prepare a moose hide. Um, you teach by doing that. But not only does Indigenous pedagogy teach how to prepare the moose hide by doing it, they also teach um, how to move forward in the future, how to be yourself, how to what to value, how to think by doing things, by partaking in traditional ways of teaching. So that's sort of one way it's different. So, ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of knowing and of learning and teaching are intimately tied to land and place. That is something that is very clear when you're thinking of um, how, like land acknowledgements and things like that, we are acknowledging the land that we're on. Um, which is important. So, Indigenous place thought is important for understanding Indigenous values and beliefs. So, if you're interested, um, you can find a paper of Indigenous place thought on Blackboard by Vanessa Watts. I posted it earlier. So, if you want to know more about that, or if you want to use it for your paper or a presentation or something, then you can look it up on Blackboard. So ontology, I know I'm hitting you with all the ologies. Ontology is the study of how we exist in society and other ways of being in the world. So how do Indigenous people exist in the world, and how is it different from Western ontology? So that one's a bit more nebulous. Like how do people exist? How do people be? So again, Indigenous ontology is tied to land and tied to environment um, in a way that Western ontology often isn't, or is tied in a way that is different. Because place theory exists in more than one like culture, like indigenous place theory versus Western place theory are different, but equally valid. So, teaching and learning. Storytelling is important for passing down traditions and knowledge in Indigenous teaching and learning, or Indigenous pedagogy. The oral tradition of passing down information is also important. So, practicing the traditional knowledge is also tied to how Indigenous people can exist in the world. So, this is all tied together in um, different ways. And it's really interesting to see how all of these things sort of tie together and influence each other. So that's what we're sort of trying to talk about here is how do these things connect? So that's one thing. So one thing that I wanted to talk about just quickly is why is it so hard to find information about Indigenous ways of knowing? And why are Indigenous ways of knowing not widely understood? So those are two questions that you might have had. Like, why is this not more widespread? Is that the colonization of North America happened in sort of like the um, early 17th century, starting in the early 17th century and working its way all the way to present day. Um, Starting in at the sort of start of Canada as a settler state. Indian residential schools were also a thing that happened, in which they took away children from their families and forced them to sort of learn how to be Western. Like they tried to like assimilate students, and quite often they would do this in violent ways. Um, and by violent, I don't mean just like physically, but spiritually and mentally as well. Um, and then there's things like the 60s scoop, which also like separated children from their families. So this was like a very deliberate thing that the Canadian government did in order to try to separate Indigenous people from their culture and to assimilate them. So that's one of the reasons why um, Indigenous people um, sometimes don't even know their own culture because of the ways that the Canadian government has acted in the past towards Indigenous people. So that's not really new information. If you're interested in learning more about Indigenous history, I suggest you look into it. Um, but this class is not on Indigenous history, so I'm just mentioning this because it impacts the ways that people know things. So there's that. So lastly, every time you learn something, it is up to you to do what you want with it. So knowledge is a responsibility. So when you're trying to carry on tradition and trying to carry on cultural knowledge and values, you might want to think about yourself and how you are what you are doing in order to carry things on. So, I think that's the end of my slides. Yes, it is. Stopping sharing. So that's my little spiel on Indigenous ways of knowing. So hopefully that was helpful for you. And I'll see everybody in class.